The villagers warned him not to enter. They spoke of the beast that lurked within, a creature neither man nor animal, but something cursed, something born of blood and rage. Yet Marcus had no choice. His brother had vanished into the ruins days ago, and no one dared to retrieve him. Armed with only a flickering torch and a rusted blade, he stepped into the labyrinth of the Minotaur. The walls were ancient, damp with the breath of something hungry. The air reeked of decay. As Marcus took cautious steps forward, the torchlight cast shifting shadows, making it seem as if the walls themselves were moving, breathing. Then, in the distance, a deep, guttural exhale. Something was awake. The stone walls loomed high around Marcus, their surfaces slick with moisture, veins of black mold creeping along the cracks like diseased tendrils. The deeper he ventured, the heavier the air became, thick with an ancient, rotting musk that clung to his throat. His torch flickered, as if the very darkness of the labyrinth was trying to consume the light. Every step echoed, bouncing off unseen corridors, making it impossible to tell whether the sounds were his own or something else's. Then, a noise, a deep, wet breath. The kind that belonged to something massive, something alive. He froze. The sound wasn't distant. It was close. His pulse hammered as he turned his head, scanning the shifting shadows. The flickering torch cast grotesque shapes along the walls, shapes that moved when he did not. His grip tightened around the rusted blade. A foolish weapon. What good was rust against a beast of legend? A scraping sound. Cloven hooves against stone. Slow, deliberate, dragging steps. Marcus turned toward the sound, his breath shallow. The passage ahead stretched into blackness, but the shadows were shifting, twisting unnaturally. Then something huge shifted in the dark, a silhouette as broad as the tunnels themselves. Its breath a low, ragged growl that vibrated through Marcus's chest. His hand trembled. He had to move. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his rusted blade. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, deafening, drowning out even the distant echoes of dripping water and the whisper of unseen things slithering in the cracks of the ancient stone. The shadows before him were shifting, thickening, as if something massive lurked just beyond the reach of his flickering torchlight. The scraping of hooves against stone came again. Slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. The ground beneath his feet shuddered with each step. He willed himself to move, stepping backward slowly, barely daring to breathe. But then a sound. Not the heavy exhale of a beast, not the rhythmic clatter of its hooves. Something else. A whisper, a voice, a human voice. Weak, trembling, barely more than a breath carried through the tunnels. Help me. Marcus's chest clenched. His brother. It had to be. His brother was alive. Every instinct screamed at him to run in the other direction, to flee while he still could. But the voice, so fragile, so desperate, held him there, pinning him between survival and the unbreakable bond of blood. He stepped forward, toward the darkness, toward the monstrous presence waiting in the labyrinth's belly. Then the air itself seemed to shift. A rush of wind, foul and hot, pushed against him, extinguishing his torch in an instant. The darkness swallowed him whole. A growl, low, deep, too close. Marcus could hear it breathing now, feel the sheer massive weight of the thing lurking just beyond his reach, the rhythmic huff of its breath, the sickening wetness of saliva snapping from its jaws, the sheer oppressive heat of its body pressing against the air. It was here. Then the scrape of claws against stone, not hooves, claws, long, jagged, unnatural. The breath came again, this time from just above him. The hairs on his neck rose as he realized with bone-freezing certainty that whatever loomed over him was watching, waiting. And then, in the pitch black, came the sound that shattered his resolve. A deep, rattling chuckle. Not animal, something worse. Marcus's blood turned to ice. That sound, low, guttural, intelligent. It wasn't the mindless growl of a beast. It wasn't the soulless exhale of a monster driven by hunger alone. No, this thing knew. It knew he was afraid. It knew he was trapped. And worst of all, it enjoyed it. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. He gripped his useless blade tighter, the rusted metal biting into his palm. He needed light, any light. He fumbled at his belt, shaking fingers searching for the flint he'd brought. His breath hitched, chest rising and falling in sharp, frantic gulps as he struck the stone, desperate for a spark. Click. Nothing. Click. Still nothing. A slow, dragging inhale from the darkness, so close now that he could feel the hot, damp breath curl against his skin. Marcus's hand trembled. Click. A spark. A single, tiny spark. And for the briefest second, the cavern was illuminated. And he saw it. The horns were the first thing. Massive, curved things, jagged and splintered at the edges like they had been used as weapons. Below them, the outline of a head. Not human, not entirely beast. The face was long, almost skeletal, its features twisted in some grotesque approximation of a grin. The stench of raw meat and blood rolled off it in waves, thick enough to choke him. Then the eyes. They gleamed in the darkness. Not red, not yellow, black. Endless. Twin abysses that reflected nothing, empty voids that devoured the light before it even reached them. The spark fizzled out. Darkness again. A noise. A wet snap. Bone? Flesh? Marcus's breath hitched as the growling returned, deep, resonant, almost amused. Then the voice. Run! A whisper, but somehow it filled the entire labyrinth. Marcus did. His feet slammed against the stone as he turned and bolted into the dark, sprinting blind, barely able to tell if he was even moving forward or deeper into some hellish abyss. He could hear it behind him, the heavy, thundering footfalls, hooves and claws moving impossibly fast, the sound of stone cracking, dust falling from the ancient ceiling, as if the very labyrinth was trembling at the creature's pursuit. Then, the laughter again. Not far at all. Marcus ran harder than he ever had in his life, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest, but the laughter followed. Deep, guttural, thick with something that made his skin crawl. Enjoyment. The Minotaur was toying with him. It wasn't chasing him to kill him. Not yet. The labyrinth twisted around him like a living thing. Every corridor looked the same. Endless stone, slick with moisture, pulsing with the weight of something ancient and wrong. His footsteps echoed wildly, rebounding off unseen walls, making it impossible to tell where he was going, or worse if he was running in circles. A flicker of light. There. Up ahead, a faint glow, the first sign of anything but darkness. His chest ached, his vision blurred with exhaustion, but he pushed forward, sprinting for it, desperate for escape. He could hear the beast behind him, not running, no walking, casual, unhurried, because it knew. Marcus reached the light, bursting into a wider chamber, and stopped dead. The walls were wrong. Bones, hundreds, thousands of them, piled high, embedded into the stone. Some human, others warped and monstrous, fused together as if the labyrinth itself had fed upon them. Skulls grinned at him from their prison of rock, hollow eyes watching. And then he saw the bodies that were still fresh. Blood pooled along the edges of the chamber, dark and viscous, sinking into the floor like the labyrinth itself was drinking it in. And in the center, slumped against the wall, legs splayed, eyes wide and glassy, his brother. Marcus's stomach lurched. He stumbled forward, dropping to his knees. His brother's skin was pale, slick with sweat. His lips moved, soundless, breath so weak it barely stirred the air. No, hey, stay with me! Marcus grabbed his shoulders, shaking him, trying to pull him back from the edge of unconsciousness. But his brother's lips trembled, his fingers twitching weakly as he lifted a shaking hand and pointed behind Marcus. Marcus's blood ran cold. A shadow swallowed the light. The chamber darkened. A low, satisfied growl rumbled through the walls. Marcus turned. The Minotaur stood in the entrance, and it was smiling. Marcus's body locked up in sheer, primal terror. The Minotaur filled the entrance entirely, blocking any hope of escape. Its hulking form cast a shadow that seemed to stretch and consume the chamber, swallowing the weak, flickering light. The grin remained, wide, wrong. The thing's lips curled back just enough to reveal jagged, yellowed teeth, still wet with something dark, something fresh. Its chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths, each exhale thick with the stench of rot and blood. Marcus tried to move, to scramble back, but his body refused, trapped, helpless. His brother made a weak, gurgling sound beside him, his trembling fingers still raised, still pointing, as if his mind had frozen on one final, desperate warning. The Minotaur tilted its head, slowly, deliberately, studying him. Then it spoke. A voice like stone grating against stone, low and inhuman, yet laced with something disturbingly aware. You came for him. Marcus's stomach twisted. The beast's mouth barely moved, its black, bottomless eyes locked onto him like a predator savoring its kill. It took a single, slow step forward. Hoof against stone. The impact rattled through Marcus's bones. Good. Marcus snapped out of his frozen terror. Move! Move! He lunged for his brother, grasping under his arms, trying to hoist him up. His limbs felt like lead, his muscles weak with exhaustion, but adrenaline drove him. The Minotaur didn't stop him, it watched. Marcus staggered back, dragging his brother, his mind screaming for a plan, an escape, anything. But the beast, it just waited, until it didn't. The change was instant. The grin vanished. It moved. A blur of muscle and darkness, a sound like a landslide. The Minotaur's massive arm lashed out with impossible speed. Marcus didn't react in time. Pain, a flash of red. A force like a battering ram slammed into his ribs, lifting him clean off the ground, sending him crashing into the bone-covered wall. He heard something snap. His own body. His own bones. The world blurred, twisted with agony. His vision swam. Darkness crept at the edges. The last thing he saw, the Minotaur stepping toward his brother. Slow, hungry. Marcus tried to scream, but his breath wouldn't come. Pain exploded through his ribs, his lungs spasming as he gasped for air that wouldn't reach him. His body refused to move, shattered, broken, useless. But his mind was awake, and it was screaming, his brother, his brother. He could only watch, helpless, as the Minotaur closed the distance, each step slow, deliberate, savoring the moment. Its massive hand flexed, clawed fingers twitching, as if it was deciding exactly how to tear him apart. His brother's chest barely moved, still alive, but not for long. Marcus's vision blurred with pain and rage. Move. He had to move. His fingers scraped against the ground, finding only shards of bone and dried blood. His other hand? Where was his sword? Gone, knocked from his grasp when the beast had struck him. He struggled, tried to drag himself forward, but the pain swallowed him whole. The Minotaur reached down. Marcus's brother twitched, his glassy eyes widening as the massive clawed fingers curled around his throat. His lips parted, but only a choked wheeze escaped. He was too weak to scream. Marcus forced his body to move. His arm dragged him forward. Inches. He had no plan, no strength, no chance. But he couldn't watch this. He wouldn't. The Minotaur lifted his brother from the ground effortlessly, as if he weighed nothing at all. His feet dangled, his fingers weakly scratching at the beast's wrist. The Minotaur turned its head slightly, watching Marcus. Then it grinned again. Snap! The sound was deafening, wet, final. Marcus's entire world stopped. His brother went limp. The beast dropped him, a discarded thing, useless now. Silence. Then the Minotaur turned fully to Marcus. It stepped forward, closer. The heat of it, the sheer wrongness of it, pressed down on him like a suffocating weight. It crouched. Its massive form blocked out everything else. Marcus could barely see, barely think. But he heard it. You are last. It reached for him. Marcus's body screamed in protest as he tried to move, but it was useless. His limbs were dead weight, his chest a shattered ruin. Every breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps, each one laced with agony. He could taste blood, his own. His vision blurred, the world tilting sideways, but through the haze of pain and shock, one truth burned clear in his mind. His brother was dead. A sound tried to crawl up his throat, a scream, a sob, a curse he didn't know. But nothing came. There was no strength left, only hatred. The Minotaur knelt beside him, close enough that Marcus could feel the heat rolling off its scarred, blood-stained skin, close enough that its breath, thick with rot and gore, curled against his cheek like a whisper of death itself. It had won, and it knew it. Its massive clawed hand reached out, slow, deliberate, savoring the moment. A predator, playing with its prey. Marcus's fingers twitched weakly against the stone. He felt something, bone shards, dust, blood. Nothing useful, nothing that could save him. But then his fingers brushed metal, his sword, half buried beneath the rubble, its hilt slick with his own blood, out of reach. The Minotaur's hand curled around his throat, not squeezing, not yet, just holding him there, claiming him. Marcus's vision darkened. His lungs screamed. He had seconds. With the last of his strength, he lunged. His fingers wrapped around the sword's hilt. His body exploded in pain, but he didn't care. He swung. The blade, rusted, dull, worthless, sank into the Minotaur's neck. A wet, sickening tear, a sound. Not a roar, not a growl. Something worse. A gasp, a choking, gurgling rasp. The Minotaur's grip on his throat tightened, crushing. But its body shuddered. Marcus twisted the blade. A deep, terrible crack. The Minotaur lurched back. Its massive form staggered. One hand shot to its throat, grasping, struggling, failing. The black voids of its eyes, those endless hollow pits, widened in something Marcus had never expected to see. Shock. Fear. It tried to stand, tried to roar, but all that came was a wet, choking gurgle. Then it fell. The impact shook the labyrinth. Marcus lay there, his body broken, his vision dimming as the beast twitched, convulsed, then finally, mercifully, went still. Silence. Then Marcus let the darkness take him. Darkness swallowed Marcus whole. He drifted in and out of it, the weight of exhaustion, pain, and something deeper, something colder, pulling him down like a heavy tide. His body no longer felt real, just raw, open nerve endings and fading warmth. Was this death? He couldn't tell how much time passed. Seconds, hours, maybe more. Then a sound. Not the Minotaur, not the deep guttural breath of a beast lurking in the shadows. Something else. Footsteps. Soft, cautious, human. Marcus's eyes fluttered open. His vision was a blurred haze of stone and bone, his head throbbing in time with his heartbeat. He could barely move, barely breathe. But he wasn't alone. A shadow passed over him. A figure standing just beyond the Minotaur's massive, motionless corpse. The light was dim, the air thick with the stench of blood and rot, but Marcus could make out the faint outline of a hooded shape. Not a villager, not a rescuer. Something else. The figure knelt beside him. For a long moment it didn't speak, just watched. Then a voice. Soft, ancient, knowing. You killed it. Marcus tried to speak. His throat burned. No words came. The hooded figure reached out, fingers brushing over his forehead, a touch as cold as the grave. A deep hum vibrated through the air, low, rhythmic, unnatural. It sent a chill through Marcus's broken body, through the very marrow of his bones. The labyrinth itself seemed to shift. The walls, the ceiling, even the air. It was changing. Then the figure spoke again. Now you will take its place. Marcus's breath hitched. His body locked up. No. The hooded figure pressed its palm against his chest. A deep, searing pain erupted from within, as if something inside him was breaking, reshaping. His bones shifted. His skin tightened. His heartbeat slowed, then strengthened. The corpse of the Minotaur began to dissolve, sinking into the ground like dust swept away by an unseen force. Its blood soaked into the stone, the very walls drinking it in. And then Marcus felt it, something crawling beneath his skin, a heaviness in his limbs, a hunger. His breath deepened, became thicker, heavier. The hooded figure leaned in close, whispering in his ear. The labyrinth must always have a beast. Marcus tried to scream, but what came out was a growl. Marcus's mind fractured. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the pain was. The tearing, twisting, reshaping of his body was. His skin felt too tight, like it was splitting at the seams. His bones cracked and stretched, shifting in ways they weren't meant to. His fingers curled inward, nails thickening, darkening, becoming claws. His chest expanded, his ribcage warping outward, muscles thickening, his breath coming in deep, guttural heaves, his legs bent the wrong way. A sickening pop echoed through the chamber as his knees snapped backward, the bones reshaping, his feet splitting and hardening into hooves. He tried to move, to fight, but his arms bulged, veins black as tar pulsing under his skin, his hands shaking as they grew larger, rougher, more monstrous. Then, his face. Agony tore through his skull, his jaw wrenched forward, his teeth elongating, sharpening. His ears stretched, his nose flattening, his entire head reshaping, twisting, transforming. Something pushed out of his skull. Horns. The weight of them nearly pulled him forward. He tried to scream, but what came out was a horrible, wet, snarling bellow. The hooded figure only watched. Its voice was calm, final. It is done. The air shifted. The ground trembled beneath him. The labyrinth moved. The walls reshaped. The old bones, the old blood, the ancient decay sank into the stone, feeding it, strengthening it. The corridors twisted, stretched, growing deeper, more complex. The curse had been passed. Marcus's mind reeled, trapped in his own monstrous body, his thoughts still his own, but buried, distant, fading. A hunger stirred within him, deep, endless. The hooded figure stepped back into the shadows. Marcus, the Minotaur, stood. The labyrinth waited, and in the distance, faint but growing closer, a new victim had entered, and Marcus was starving. The end.